knew something was wrong the moment I saw the table. Not a feeling, not a guess, a fact. Every name card was lined up neatly in front of Calvin's guests. Business partners, distant relatives, even Vanessa, the woman Talia insisted was helping the family grow. My eyes moved slowly from one chair to another, expecting to see my place somewhere at the head beside my husband. I checked twice because I thought maybe age was playing tricks on me. My name wasn't there. I didn't panic. I didn't ask a waiter. I simply stood still long enough to understand what I was looking at. 35 years of marriage, and at my husband's birthday dinner, a dinner I personally arranged, there was no seat for me. Talia spotted me first. She leaned back in her chair, smiling like this was a harmless mistake. "Oops," she said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Guess we skipped yours." A few people laughed, not cruelly at first, more like they didn't want to make things awkward. But laughter spreads fast when nobody stops it. Someone at the table added, "There's always room somewhere else," as if I were an extra guest who arrived uninvited. I looked at Calvin. That was the moment that hurt. He didn't frown, didn't question it, didn't even ask where I would sit. He adjusted his jacket and nodded at a waiter like the evening should continue. The man I stood beside through bankruptcy scares, health scares, and family storms acted like I had simply shown up too early, and that told me everything. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. What I felt instead was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when something finally makes sense after years of small, uncomfortable moments you tried to ignore. The late meetings I wasn't invited to. The way Talia started speaking for both of us in front of others. Vanessa sitting closer and closer to Calvin at public events. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. I stepped closer to the table so my voice wouldn't have to rise. People were still smiling, waiting for me to laugh it off and sit somewhere behind the main group. "Seems I'm not family then," I said calmly. Nobody knew what to do with that sentence. The laughter faded into silence. Talia's smile froze. Calvin finally looked at me. Not guilty, not angry, just uncomfortable. Like he wished I would make the moment easier for him. I didn't give him that. I turned and walked away. No speech, no scene, just dignity. Outside the private dining area, I took out my phone and made 3 calls. Short conversations, clear instructions. The event account was in my name, and I had never transferred authority, something I had kept quiet about because I believed respect didn't need paperwork. Tonight proved me wrong. 30 minutes later, my phone buzzed with confirmation messages, one after another. Catering halted, music contract suspended, transport arrangements canceled. I didn't go back inside to watch it happen. I didn't need to. I sat alone in the lobby, feeling the strange weight of relief settle in my chest. Not triumph, not revenge, just the steady realization that I had finally stopped pretending. Behind me, footsteps rushed through the hallway. Voices rose, confused and sharp. Someone said the band had stopped without explanation. Another voice argued with a coordinator about unpaid balances. I kept my eyes forward, listening without turning around. Then I heard the hotel manager speaking softly to Calvin, close enough that his words carried. "Sir, Mrs. Etta is listed as the sole account holder. All authorization comes from her." Silence followed. Not the kind of silence that hurts, the kind that shifts power. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to breathe fully, knowing that the seat they removed from the table was never the one that gave me value. I didn't wait for sunrise. By the time most of the family finished arguing about what went wrong at Calvin's dinner, I had already checked out of the hotel. No farewell messages, no dramatic exits, just a quiet ride to the airport with one suitcase and a mind that refused to rest. The driver tried to make conversation about the weather, about how beautiful the island looked at dawn. I nodded politely, but my thoughts stayed fixed on that table, on the empty space where my name should have been. Airports are strange places when you're leaving alone after something breaks inside you. Everyone around me moved with purpose. Couples arguing over boarding passes, families laughing too loudly, and I felt like I was walking through a world that had shifted slightly out of alignment. Not broken, just different. I boarded early and took the window seat. For years, Calvin handled our travel plans, insisting he knew the best routes, the best upgrades, the best timing. This time, I chose everything myself. That felt small, but it mattered. As the plane lifted, memories began pushing forward. Not loud ones, just moments I had ignored because they didn't seem serious enough at the time. The first time Talia introduced Vanessa at a family gathering and called her the future of the brand, laughing when I asked what that meant. The way Calvin started saying, "You don't need to worry about that anymore," whenever financial decisions came up. The way invitations to certain meetings arrived addressed only to him and Talia, never to me, even though the accounts and contracts still carried my name. Little things, little cuts, none of them strong enough alone to look like betrayal. Until last night. Halfway through the flight, my phone buzzed softly. I expected another message from Calvin, maybe an apology written carefully enough to avoid responsibility. Instead, it was from my grandson, Malik. "Grandma, I'm sorry about yesterday. I didn't think they'd really do it. My mom said the seating was symbolic. She told the planner you weren't supposed to be at the main table." I read the message twice. Symbolic. That word sat heavy in my chest. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was planned. A quiet announcement to everyone watching that my place beside Calvin had already been reassigned. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the plane's low hum steady me. For the first time since leaving the dinner, anger tried to rise. Not loud anger, but the slow-burning kind that comes when truth replaces doubt. When we landed, I didn't go home right away. I went straight to my office, a space Calvin rarely used anymore, filled with files I had kept organized for years, even when nobody asked me to. The building felt too quiet without the noise of family moving through it. And I turned on a lamp, set my suitcase by the door, and opened my laptop. Travel invoices were still linked to my account. I scrolled through the event folder slowly, careful not to rush past anything. Flights, catering, seating charts, vendor approvals, all neatly arranged under the Hawaii project. Then I saw it. A digital authorization log attached to the final seating plan, authorized by Vanessa, not Calvin, not Talia, Vanessa. I leaned back in my chair, letting that realization settle fully before reacting. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. Someone outside the marriage had been given permission to move me, to edit my presence, using authority that should never have belonged to her. The room felt colder. I opened another file, this time the guest coordination notes, and to notice small adjustments made weeks before the trip. Table placements shifted, head table labels changed. My name moved from primary host to guest. Optional. Optional. The word made my stomach tighten, but it also cleared something inside me. Last night wasn't the beginning of disrespect. It was the final step of a plan that had been building quietly while I chose patience over suspicion. My phone buzzed again. This time a message from Calvin. "We need to talk when you get back." I didn't answer. Instead, I kept scrolling through the invoices, watching Vanessa's approvals appear again and again like fingerprints left in plain sight. And as the truth unfolded across my screen, one thought settled firmly in my mind. The missing seat wasn't just about family, it was about control. And someone had already started taking mine long before that dinner ever began. The more I read, the less surprised I felt. Vanessa's name kept appearing across the planning files, not as a guest, not as an assistant, but as someone giving direction. Seating arrangements, guest confirmations, even which relatives were placed closest to Calvin at the table. The pattern wasn't messy or rushed. It was organized, deliberate, rehearsed. That was when it finally clicked. The dinner wasn't just a birthday celebration, it was a stage. And I had been written out of the script long before I walked into that room. I closed the laptop and sat still for a moment, letting memory do the rest of the work. Small things I had dismissed came back sharper now. The strategy meeting Calvin said would be too technical for me. The charity event where Talia introduced Vanessa as someone who would guide the family into the next era. The business dinner where a chair had been placed between Calvin and Vanessa while I sat across the room with distant relatives. It wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a slow replacement. My phone rang just as I reached for my coat. The caller ID made me pause. Mr. Harlan. I hadn't spoken to him in years. He was the lawyer Calvin and I trusted when we first built everything from nothing, back when every contract felt like a promise rather than a shield. Age had slowed his voice, but not his clarity. I saw the cancellation notice, he said gently after I answered, and I assumed that meant you finally noticed what's been happening. There was no judgment in his tone, only quiet concern. And we met that afternoon in his small office, the same office where Calvin and I once sat side by side, planning a future that felt unbreakable. Mr. Harlan listened more than he spoke as I explained the missing seat, the approvals under Vanessa's name, the word symbolic used by my own daughter. When I finished, he slid a thin folder toward me. "You signed this years ago," he said, "after Calvin's investment loss. You insisted on protecting the family from outside influence. I remember because you were the only one thinking long-term that day." I opened the folder slowly. Legal language stared back at me. Trust structures, authority limits, succession guidelines. I had almost forgotten how determined I was back then, how clearly I saw the risk of letting emotion guide decisions. "There's something else," Mr. Harlan added. "To a clause most people overlook." He turned a page and tapped a paragraph halfway down. The wording was careful but unmistakable. Access to certain financial privileges depended on maintaining cooperative family governance, not public exclusion, not unilateral decisions made by outsiders. It wasn't written as punishment, it was written as protection. For a long moment, I said nothing. All those years, I thought I had stepped back to keep peace. I thought letting Calvin lead publicly would make things easier for everyone. But legally, my authority had never disappeared. I had simply chosen not to use it. Mr. Harlan watched my expression change. "You don't have to fight loudly," he said quietly, "but you should know. The structure you built assumes respect is mutual. If that breaks, the system shifts." Outside his office window, traffic moved slowly through the afternoon heat, life continuing, unaware that something inside me had finally turned from confusion into clarity. The Hawaii dinner wasn't humiliation. It was a test, one designed to see whether I would accept being replaced. I closed the folder carefully and stood. "Thank you," I told him, my voice steadier than I expected. As I walked out, one sentence from the document stayed with me, repeating in my mind like a quiet warning. Family unity is a condition for financial authority. And for the first time, I understood that the power everyone thought I had lost was never gone. It was waiting for me to decide whether the rules they broke would finally matter. The house looked the same from the outside, same wide driveway, same trimmed hedges, the same porch light Calvin insisted on keeping on even during the day. Nothing about it warned me that the inside would feel unfamiliar, but the moment I stepped through the front door, something shifted. The air wasn't tense. It was careful. One of the house staff met me in the hallway, offering a polite smile that stopped just short of warmth. Another passed by carrying files, lowering her eyes like she wasn't sure how long she was supposed to acknowledge me anymore. Nobody said anything openly disrespectful, but the hesitation was obvious. Conversations ended when I walked into rooms. Doors closed a little quicker than usual. It wasn't hostility. It was uncertainty. The kind that spreads when people don't know who holds authority anymore. My suitcase rolled softly across the floor as I moved deeper into the house. Like Calvin wasn't home yet. His car wasn't in the driveway. Talia's voice drifted faintly from the kitchen, speaking into her phone in a tone that sounded rehearsed. When she saw me, her words cut off mid-sentence. "Oh, you're back early," she said, avoiding my eyes as she set the phone down. I nodded once. The trip ended sooner than expected. She adjusted a stack of papers on the counter, pretending to organize them, even though nothing needed arranging. Her shoulders stayed tense, her gaze fixed on the marble surface between us. "I didn't know you were leaving the dinner like that," she added quietly. Everyone was confused. I waited for an apology that never came. Instead, she picked up her phone again and said she had a meeting to attend upstairs. When the distance in her voice told me she had already chosen a side long before the Hawaii dinner, I watched her walk away, heels tapping too quickly against the floor, and felt that same quiet clarity settle in my chest. No confrontation. Not yet. I moved toward Calvin's office. The door was slightly open, which was unusual. Calvin always closed it when he worked, even when nothing inside was private. I pushed it wider and stepped in slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the familiar room. Everything looked neat at first glance. Desk polished, shelves aligned, but the details told a different story. New folders sat stacked in one corner, thicker than the usual business reports. Sticky notes marked several pages like someone had been reviewing them recently. I didn't rush. I set my purse down, walked around the desk. Warren glanced at the top document. Legal drafts, not finalized, not signed, but detailed enough to reveal intent. My fingers paused on the page as I read, Succession Planning, Transitional Authority Framework. The words felt colder than they should have. I turned another page. Talia's name appeared in bold letters beneath a heading labeled Primary Successor. Several sections described her role in future leadership, outlining responsibilities that had always belonged to both Calvin and me together. Vanessa's name appeared in smaller print as an advisory consultant, a supporting role that suddenly explained why she had been positioned so confidently at the Hawaii dinner. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the realization settle. They weren't just moving me aside socially, but they were preparing to rewrite the structure of everything we built, quietly, legally, and without ever asking me. I closed the folder gently and placed it back where I found it. Footsteps sounded faintly in the hallway, and I stepped away from the desk before anyone noticed I had been inside. My face stayed calm, my breathing steady, but inside me, something shifted from hurt to focus. The missing seat at the dinner wasn't the end of disrespect. It was the announcement of a plan already in motion. As I reached the doorway, I glanced back once more at the stack of drafts, at Talia's name written where mine used to stand, and understood that whatever came next wouldn't be emotional. It would be deliberate. Vanessa didn't knock. She walked into the house like she belonged there. Confident steps, a slim folder tucked under her arm, and her voice already mid-conversation on the phone as she crossed the living room. The staff greeted her politely, the same careful tone they used with me now, and that alone told me enough. This wasn't her first time arriving without invitation. She ended the call when she saw me standing near the staircase. "Oh," she said, surprised but not unsettled. "I didn't realize you were back already." Her smile was polished, respectful on the surface, but it carried the quiet certainty of someone who believed she had earned a permanent seat in this space. "I came to see Calvin," she added, glancing toward his office like she knew exactly where to go. "He's not here," I said calmly. For a moment, she hesitated, as if deciding whether to stay anyway. Then she straightened slightly, shifting into a tone that sounded more professional than personal. "Well, I was asked to review some planning documents," she said. "Talia and Calvin want everything aligned before the next quarter. There's a lot changing right now." a lot changing. The words hung between us. I watched her carefully, not with anger, but with curiosity. Vanessa didn't look like someone sneaking around. She looked like someone who genuinely believed she had been given authority. Someone told she was stepping into a role that needed leadership. "You seem comfortable here," I said quietly. She didn't hear accusation in my voice, only acknowledgement. "They've made it clear they want fresh structure," she replied. "Sometimes families need outside guidance when transitions happen." Transitions. The word landed heavier than she intended. She wasn't mocking me. She wasn't even being rude. When she spoke with the calm confidence of someone who thought she was helping, and that realization changed something inside me. The real shift hadn't started with Vanessa. It had started long before, with Calvin's silence and Talia's ambition creating space for someone else to step in. I could have confronted her then. I could have pointed out that the accounts were still under my name, that the Hawaii dinner revealed more than anyone expected. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped aside and let her pass toward Calvin's office. Silence became my choice. From the hallway, I listened as she placed her folder on the desk, flipping through pages with quick, efficient movements. She hummed softly to herself, completely unaware that I had already seen the succession drafts. Yet watching her move through the room like a decision had already been made told me something important. Vanessa wasn't acting secretly. She was acting with permission. And that meant the real conversation wasn't with her. It was with the people who invited her to sit in my place. My phone buzzed in my hand. A new email notification appeared from the company's internal calendar, something I normally received automatically. I opened it without thinking. Executive Board Meeting. Strategy alignment. Date, time, location, all clearly listed. I scrolled to the attendees, Calvin, Talia, Vanessa. My name wasn't there. I read the list again slowly, feeling that same steady calm settle over me. Not shock, not anger, just confirmation. They weren't just planning around me. They were moving forward as if I had already stepped aside. Behind me, Vanessa closed Calvin's office door, unaware that the silence she walked into had already changed shape. And as I stared at the meeting notice glowing on my screen, one thought settled quietly in my mind. They weren't testing my patience anymore. They were testing how long I would pretend not to see what they were doing. The numbers didn't lie. I sat at my desk long after the house went quiet, scrolling through financial summaries that once felt routine. For years, I trusted Calvin to handle daily operations while I focused on stability. Long-term investments, safeguards, quiet structures that protected us when markets shifted. I never imagined I would be reviewing these files like an outsider searching for proof. Small transfers stood out first, not large enough to trigger alarms, not reckless, or just steady payments labeled consulting support, v. advisory. Month after month, the amounts appeared again, routed through accounts tied to Vanessa's firm. The pattern wasn't hidden. It was simply buried beneath normal expenses. Travel coordination, brand positioning, strategic alignment. I leaned back slowly, letting the realization settle. Vanessa hadn't arrived suddenly. She'd been woven into our financial structure piece by piece while I believed she was just an occasional advisor. Each transfer felt like a quiet step towards something larger, something nobody explained to me directly. My eyes moved to the authorization column. Most approvals carried Calvin's digital signature. Some carried Talia's. And then there were a few that looked like mine. That was when I stopped breathing for a moment. I clicked one open. The timestamp traced back nearly a year, to the months after my surgery, when I spent weeks recovering and allowed Calvin to handle paperwork without question. I remembered signing documents quickly, trusting that they were routine authorizations meant to keep things running while I rested. I opened the attachment. Legal language filled the screen, dense and technical. The heading read, Emergency Governance Adjustment, Temporary Authority Allocation. My name appeared beneath a digital signature line. I read slowly, carefully, forcing myself not to rush past the details. The document allowed Calvin expanded decision-making power during medical emergencies, something that made sense at the time, but deeper in the wording, tucked between paragraphs about continuity planning, was a clause I didn't remember discussing, and a clause allowing temporary redistribution of voting influence if the primary holder became inactive during recovery. Inactive. The word felt heavier now than it had back then. I scrolled further. The document had never been revoked. No expiration date, no automatic review. Just quiet language that shifted balance without announcing it openly. For a long moment, I sat still, staring at my own signature like it belonged to someone else. I wasn't angry at the version of me who signed it. She trusted her husband, trusted her daughter, trusted the idea that family decisions would never be used against her. But trust doesn't erase consequences. Outside my office window, the evening settled into silence. I opened another file comparing voting summaries from before and after the document's date, and the difference was subtle but undeniable. Small percentages moved away from me, redistributed across operational leadership, giving Calvin more leverage during board decisions. Enough leverage to invite Vanessa deeper into the structure, enough leverage to plan a succession that didn't include me. My phone buzzed with another internal notification, a reminder about the upcoming board meeting I wasn't invited to. I ignored it and returned to the document, reading the clause again until every word felt clear. This wasn't fraud. It was permission I gave during a moment of weakness. Permission written carefully enough to look harmless, while changing everything quietly. I closed the file slowly. The house remained silent around me, unaware that another layer of truth had settled into place. The missing seat at the dinner, the succession drafts, the payments to Vanessa, they all connected back to this single moment when I believed signing quickly would keep peace. Instead, it shifted power away from me, and as I stared at the clause one last time, I understood something that tightened my chest but sharpened my focus. I hadn't lost control suddenly. I had signed it away, without ever realizing what it would become. The house felt quieter the next morning, but not peaceful. People moved around me carefully. Not cold, not distant, just unsure which version of me they were supposed to face. The woman who tolerated everything, or the woman who canceled a dinner in front of the entire family. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't explain myself. Instead, I sat at the breakfast table with a cup of tea I barely touched and opened my laptop again. Where files waited where I left them, numbers steady and unemotional, but this time I wasn't searching alone. My phone lit up with a message from Malik. "Grandma, can I come by? Just you and me?" I told him yes. He arrived an hour later, nervous energy in his movements. He hugged me tightly, not out of obligation, but out of relief, like he had been holding something in too long. "I didn't know it would go that far," he said quietly once we sat down. "Mom said the dinner was meant to show everyone that things were changing, that you were stepping back." "Did she say why?" I asked. He hesitated. "She thinks Grandpa listens more to Vanessa now, and Vanessa keeps telling her the family needs a new face in public. Mom said she didn't want to hurt you, but she also didn't want to look weak." I absorbed that slowly. Talia wasn't just being cruel, and she was trying to prove something. To Calvin, to Vanessa, maybe even to herself. That didn't excuse what happened, but it explained the pressure behind her laughter at the table. Malik left after a while, shoulders lighter than when he arrived. I stayed seated long after the door closed, turning his words over in my mind. A knock sounded softly against the office door. It was Mr. Reyes, one of the oldest employees in our company. He rarely visited the house anymore, preferring to keep business inside the office. Seeing him standing there felt like stepping back into a time when loyalty meant something simple. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said gently. "I thought you should know. Things haven't been the way they look." I gestured for him to sit. He lowered his voice instinctively, even though we were alone. When Calvin hasn't been making the real financial decisions for months, Vanessa's firm reviews everything first. Sometimes he doesn't even know the final numbers until after they're approved. That surprised me more than anything else. Calvin always valued control, sometimes too much. The idea that he had slowly handed influence away without realizing it changed how I saw the entire situation. "I'm not here to stir trouble," Mr. Reyes added, "but people in the office are confused. They don't know who to listen to anymore." "I understand," I said quietly. After he left, I opened a fresh folder on my desktop. No confrontation, no dramatic moves, just preparation. I began downloading records one by one, meeting notes, financial summaries, authorization logs, building a timeline that connected decisions to outcomes. The work felt steady, almost calming, like putting pieces of a puzzle into their proper place. As I searched through the Hawaii event files again, something new caught my attention: the guest coordination spreadsheet. I had glanced at it before, but this time I opened the full revision history. Names shifted across tables like chess pieces. Relatives who once sat near me were moved farther away. Business partners loyal to Calvin were placed closer to Vanessa. My name appeared briefly at the head table in early drafts, then removed entirely 3 weeks before the trip. A note in the margin read, "Adjust to reinforce transition optics." I stared at the screen, letting the words sink in. This wasn't just a family oversight. The dinner had been curated, shaped carefully to create a moment where my absence would look natural, even humorous. I closed the spreadsheet slowly, the weight of that realization settling deeper than anger ever could. They hadn't just left my seat empty. They had designed the entire room to make sure everyone watched it happen. I arrived early. Not through the main entrance where everyone expected to see Calvin or Vanessa first, but through the side corridor that led directly to the executive floor. The receptionist froze for a second when she saw me, then stood quickly, unsure whether to greet me formally or quietly. "I'll let them know you're here," she said. "No," I replied gently. "You don't need to announce me." The boardroom doors were already closed when I reached them. Voices drifted through the glass, calm, professional, confident. I recognized Vanessa's tone immediately, steady and rehearsed. On explaining something about restructuring timelines, for a moment I stood outside, listening, not to catch secrets, but to understand the rhythm of a meeting that had been planned without me. Then I opened the door. Conversation stopped. Chairs shifted, papers froze mid-turn. Calvin looked up first, surprise flashing across his face before he masked it with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Talia's shoulders stiffened beside him. Vanessa paused mid-sentence, her expression composed but clearly unprepared for my presence. I walked in calmly and took a seat near the center of the table, not at the head, not as a challenge, simply as someone who belonged there. "I hope I'm not late," I said softly. Nobody answered immediately. The silence wasn't hostile. It was uncertain, the kind that spreads when people realize a situation isn't unfolding the way they expected. Vanessa recovered first, offering a professional nod before continuing her presentation. "As I was saying," she began, turning back to the screen, "the proposed structure creates clearer leadership pathways and reduces reliance on legacy oversight." Legacy oversight. I understood what she meant without needing clarification. Slide after slide appeared. Organizational charts, projected growth models, role adjustments that gradually shifted decision-making away from me. Nothing looked aggressive on the surface. Everything was framed as efficiency, modernization, progress. But the pattern was obvious. My influence didn't disappear suddenly in her plan. It faded slowly, and replaced by committees and advisory roles that sounded respectful while removing real authority. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I watched Calvin instead. He nodded along at certain points, occasionally glancing at me as if waiting for a reaction. Talia avoided my eyes entirely, focusing on her notes like she hoped invisibility would make the tension disappear. Vanessa finished the presentation with a confident smile. "We believe this transition will stabilize operations and position the family for long-term growth," she said, hands folded neatly on the table. All eyes shifted toward me. The room expected resistance, maybe even anger. I gave them neither. Instead, I opened the folder in front of me, the one Mr. Harlan had helped me review, and spoke calmly. "Thank you for the work you've put into this," I said, my voice steady. "It's clear a lot of effort went into the proposal." Relief flickered briefly across Calvin's face, as if he believed cooperation meant agreement. Then I reached for the voting form. "As majority owner," I continued quietly, "I'm requesting that all decisions outlined here be postponed, pending further review." The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. Vanessa's expression tightened just slightly. Not anger, but surprise. Talia looked up sharply. Calvin leaned back in his chair, the realization settling slowly that the meeting he thought would finalize a transition had just shifted direction completely. I signed the postponement notice and slid it toward the center of the table. No raised voice, no accusation, just a decision. The room fell into a new kind of silence, one that didn't belong to uncertainty anymore. It belonged to the understanding that the woman they expected to stay absent had just reminded them she still held the power to slow everything down. They expected a fight. After the boardroom meeting, the house felt like it was waiting for raised voices. Doors closing hard, long arguments echoing down the hallway, someone demanding explanations. But I didn't give them that. I moved through the next few days quietly, speaking only when necessary, keeping my routine steady enough that nobody could predict what I was thinking. Silence unsettles people more than anger ever could. Calvin tried first. He found me in the garden late one afternoon, hands in his pockets like he wasn't sure whether to stand close or keep his distance. "You didn't have to embarrass everyone like that," he said carefully, choosing his words as if they might break. "I postponed a decision," I replied. "Nothing more." "That meeting was important," he insisted. "We were trying to move forward." I met his eyes calmly. Forward doesn't mean leaving people behind. He didn't argue again. Instead, he walked away slowly, frustration heavy in his shoulders. Not because I had yelled, but because I hadn't. Or inside the office, I began making small adjustments that felt almost invisible. Accounts tied directly to my authority were reviewed and updated. Access levels changed quietly, following the exact wording of the trust documents Mr. Harlan had shown me. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just boundaries restored where they had slowly faded. I closed 2 operational credit lines that no longer required automatic approvals. Another account shifted from open access to dual authorization, a standard safeguard that should have been in place long ago. Each change created a ripple, subtle at first, but noticeable to anyone who depended on easy spending. The first sign came from Calvin's office. He paced while speaking on the phone, voice tight with confusion. "No, that shouldn't be necessary," he said. "Why, we've never needed extra clearance before." I stayed at my desk, listening without looking up. Later that evening, Talia knocked softly on my door. Her confidence from earlier weeks seemed thinner now, replaced by hesitation. "Mom, did you change something with the accounts?" she asked. "I reviewed them," I said simply. She hesitated before speaking again. "Vanessa said adjustments were temporary, that everything would stabilize once the restructuring went through." I watched her carefully. For the first time since Hawaii, doubt flickered behind her words. Not toward me, but toward the person she trusted to guide her. "Did she tell you why my seat was removed from the dinner?" I asked quietly. Talia didn't answer. Her silence said enough. She left the room slowly, closing the door behind her like she was trying to keep a storm from spilling into the hallway. That night, my phone buzzed repeatedly with automated alerts confirming the changes I had made. Legal notices were sent to vendors, updating authorization protocols in language so formal it felt almost cold. The next morning, Calvin's voice carried through the house, sharper than usual. "I don't understand," he said into his phone. "Why are payments suddenly on hold?" A pause. Then another voice faintly echoed through the speaker. Professional, apologetic. "Sir, we've received updated instructions. All future payments require approval from Mrs. Etta before processing." I didn't step into the room. I didn't correct anyone. I simply sat at my desk listening to the shift settle into place, not through confrontation, but through structure. And I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not Calvin, not Talia, and certainly not Vanessa. Some conversations need silence around them before they can mean anything. Mr. Harlan's office sat at the end of a quiet street, unchanged from the last time I visited. Same narrow hallway, same shelves, filled with folders that held decades of decisions nobody outside that room would ever fully understand. He greeted me with a knowing look, like he had been expecting this moment long before I did. "You've been busy," he said gently as I sat across from him. "I've been paying attention," I corrected. He nodded, sliding a thicker file onto the table between us. The folder carried my handwriting on the tab, dated years ago, back when Calvin's investment loss nearly fractured everything we built. I remembered that period clearly. Long nights, to quiet fear and a determination to make sure one mistake would never threaten the entire family again. "I created something back then," I said, resting my hand on the file, "but I stopped looking at it because things felt stable." Mr. Harlan opened the folder slowly, turning it so I could read along. The trust structure filled page after page, layered protections designed not just for finances, but for relationships. At the time, I didn't want power. I wanted balance. "This document isn't about punishment," he reminded me. "It's about preserving cooperation." I read the clauses carefully, noticing details I had forgotten. Authority could be shared, but respect had to remain mutual. Major decisions required transparent agreement between family leaders. And outside consultants could advise, but they couldn't quietly replace internal voices without review. The wording felt almost gentle, like it trusted people to behave with integrity. "They never read this fully, did they?" I asked. Mr. Harlan shook his head. "Calvin skimmed it when you signed, but most people assume legal safeguards won't ever matter. They forget until something shifts." My mind moved back to the Hawaii dinner, to the missing seat, to Vanessa's confident presentations, to Talia's silence in the boardroom. Every piece now felt connected to a document that had been sitting quietly in a drawer, while everyone else acted like I had stepped aside permanently. "There's a clause here," he continued, tapping a section near the middle. "One you wrote yourself. And it activates if leadership decisions begin excluding a primary holder or if governance becomes unilateral." I leaned forward, reading the paragraph slowly. The language was clear. If cooperation broke down, if decisions were made without inclusive leadership, a review process could be triggered automatically, not as revenge, as protection. I felt something steady settle in my chest. All those years I thought stepping back kept peace. I thought silence meant maturity, but the structure I built never expected me to disappear completely. It assumed partnership would remain intact. Mr. Harlan watched my expression shift. "You don't have to confront anyone loudly," he said, "but legally, the conditions for review may already exist." I closed the folder gently, letting my fingers rest on the cover for a moment. Outside the window, cars moved slowly through the afternoon light, unaware that a quiet decision had just changed the shape of everything ahead. Then we proceed carefully, I said. He nodded. As I stood to leave, one thought stayed with me. Not heavy, not angry, just clear. The document they never bothered to read had been waiting patiently for the moment respect stopped being mutual. And now, without a single argument, the trigger conditions for leadership review were finally active. The dinner felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, just careful. Everyone sat straighter, spoke softer, as if one wrong word might reopen something none of them knew how to fix. Calvin insisted on hosting, saying it was time the family moved forward. But the table carried a tension that didn't disappear no matter how many times he refilled glasses or changed the subject. And I took my seat without comment. Nobody mentioned Hawaii. Nobody joked about missing chairs. The silence around that memory felt heavier than the moment itself. Talia watched me more than she spoke. Every time our eyes met, she looked away quickly, like she wanted to say something, but didn't know where to begin. Halfway through the meal, she finally cleared her throat. Some things came out wrong the other night, she said carefully, addressing the table instead of me directly. We were trying to make changes feel natural. Maybe we pushed too hard. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was closer than anything she had offered before. Calvin nodded as if that was enough to smooth everything over. Vanessa, seated beside him, kept her posture perfectly straight, her smile polite but tight around the edges. She looked less certain than she had in the boardroom, though she hid it well. We can't stall progress because of one uncomfortable moment, Vanessa said gently, turning toward Calvin. Transitions are always messy. The sooner we finalize the succession structure, the easier this will be for everyone. Her words were calm, professional, but they carried urgency beneath the surface. Calvin glanced at me briefly before answering her. We'll review everything soon, he said. There's no need to rush. Vanessa's gaze flicked toward me again, measuring, calculating. She didn't challenge him openly, but I could see the pressure she applied through tone alone. Subtle reminders that delay meant uncertainty. I listened without interrupting. The old version of me might have defended my place at the table, what might have demanded clarity in front of everyone. But tonight I chose something different. I asked simple questions, passed dishes quietly, and let the conversation move around me like a current I no longer needed to fight. That composure unsettled them more than anger would have. Talia's voice softened as the evening continued. Mom, I know things haven't felt right lately, she said at one point, almost too quietly for others to hear. I thought I was helping. I know, I replied calmly. She looked relieved for a second, until Vanessa leaned closer to Calvin again, whispering something about upcoming deadlines and investor expectations. The tension returned instantly, sharper than before. The doorbell rang just as dessert was served. One of the staff answered and returned a moment later carrying 2 sealed envelopes. These were delivered by courier, she said, placing them on the table. Calvin frowned as he picked one up. Vanessa reached for the other, her confidence slipping slightly when she saw the legal firm's name printed across the front. Neither spoke at first. Calvin opened his envelope slowly, eyes moving across the page until the color drained from his face. Vanessa's reaction came a second later. A brief pause, a tightening of her jaw, the quiet realization that something had shifted beyond her control. I didn't reach for anything. I didn't explain. I simply sat there, composed, as the room absorbed the meaning of the letters. Formal notices initiating a leadership review process, neither of them expected to arrive so soon, and for the first time since that night in Hawaii, the laughter that once filled this family had turned into something else entirely. Fear. Nobody spoke much on the way to the review. Calvin drove in silence, his hands tighter on the wheel than usual. Talia sat beside him, staring out the window as if she could outrun whatever waited ahead. Vanessa arrived separately, walking into the building with the same calm posture she always carried. but the confidence looked thinner now, stretched by the letter she received the night before. The conference room felt colder than the boardroom ever had. Mr. Harlan sat at the far end of the table with 2 legal associates beside him, folders arranged neatly in front of them. The atmosphere wasn't hostile. It was precise. The kind of quiet that comes when decisions are made through documents rather than arguments. "Now, this is a procedural review," he began. "No accusations, just clarification of authority, governance, and compliance with the trust structure." I took my seat without looking at anyone directly. Calvin shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa opened her notebook, ready to defend herself, while Talia watched the room like she was trying to understand where she fit into it now. The first file presented was the Hawaii event record. Revision histories appeared on the screen, seating charts changing over time, authorization logs tied to Vanessa's consultancy account. The note about transition optics was read aloud, not with drama, but with careful neutrality. Vanessa's voice stayed steady. "Those adjustments were made with the intention of aligning public messaging," she explained. "Then I was acting under the belief that the family wanted a gradual leadership shift." Mr. Harlan nodded politely. "Advisors may recommend changes," he said, "but under the trust, symbolic exclusion of a primary holder triggers review conditions." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Next came financial summaries. The consulting payments, expanded approvals during my recovery period, and the subtle redistribution of voting influence. Nothing illegal appeared on the surface, but the pattern showed a clear move toward restructuring authority without full consensus. Calvin leaned forward slowly, confusion replacing defensiveness. "I thought the document we signed gave us flexibility," he said quietly. "It did," Mr. Harlan replied, "but flexibility doesn't replace ownership, Mrs. Etta remains the primary authority under the structure you both created." For a moment, Calvin said nothing. The realization moved across his face slowly. Not anger, not shame, just the heavy understanding that he had misunderstood the boundaries of his own power. Vanessa closed her notebook. "So, what does this mean for my role?" she asked. "It means your advisory authority is suspended pending review," Mr. Harlan answered calmly. "You may continue as a consultant only if invited collectively by the family leadership." Her shoulders stiffened, but she nodded once. There was no argument left to make. The room shifted then, quieter, heavier, as attention turned toward Talia. She looked from one face to another, waiting for someone to explain what came next. Mr. Harlan opened the final folder. "Succession drafts," he said. "Prepared, but never ratified." Talia leaned closer, scanning the pages quickly. Her name filled the document. Titles, responsibilities, public positioning plans, language that framed her as the future face of the family. Her expression changed as she read further. "These sections," she said slowly, voice tightening, "they place me above both of you publicly." Vanessa didn't speak. Calvin looked equally surprised, turning pages as if seeing them clearly for the first time. "I thought this was a partnership transition," Talia continued, her voice quieter now. "Not a replacement." Silence followed. I watched her carefully, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet sadness that came from seeing truth arrive too late to feel gentle. She closed the folder slowly, the weight of the realization settling across her shoulders. And the meeting wasn't just about authority anymore. It was about understanding that the role she believed she was stepping into had never been designed to include me beside her, only to position her where I once stood alone. No one argued after the review. There were no raised voices in the hallway, no dramatic accusations, just quiet footsteps and the soft closing of doors as each person processed what had been said. Vanessa stood near the elevator, holding the thin folder that once gave her authority inside our family. The confidence she carried into the house weeks ago had faded into something more measured. She looked at me briefly. I believed I was helping, she said, not defensive, just tired. I didn't expect things to unfold like this. I know, I replied calmly. There was nothing left to debate. On the advisory contracts dissolved with polite language and final signatures, ending not with scandal, but with a quiet understanding that her role had crossed boundaries the structure could no longer allow. She nodded once, stepped into the elevator, and left without another word. Calvin watched the doors close. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain, not about me, but about himself. The documents had made one thing clear. The authority he thought he held independently had always been shared. Decisions he once made quickly would now require collaboration again. I didn't realize how much had shifted, he said quietly as we walked back toward the conference room. I thought I was protecting the family from instability. And maybe you were, I answered, but protection without partnership turns into control. He didn't argue. Though back at the house later that evening, Talia knocked on my door with a hesitation that felt unfamiliar. She stood there for a long moment before speaking, her voice softer than I had heard in years. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said finally. I thought, if I stepped forward, everyone would feel secure. Vanessa said the family needed someone who looked strong. I listened without interrupting. The dinner, she added, her eyes lowering. I knew about the seating plan. I told myself it was just symbolic. But seeing those documents today, her voice trailed off, heavy with realization. I didn't understand what it meant to you. I let the silence sit between us before answering. Intentions don't erase impact, I said gently, but understanding can change what happens next. She nodded slowly, or the weight of that truth settling deeper than any lecture would have. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't ask her to explain herself again. Instead, I returned to my desk and opened a fresh document, one I had been drafting quietly since the review began. Structure mattered more than emotion now. The family didn't need another argument, it needed clarity. Calvin watched from the doorway as I worked, his expression shifting from uncertainty to cautious respect. The atmosphere in the house felt different, less like a battlefield and more like a space waiting for direction. When I finished, I printed several copies and placed them neatly in a folder. I'll present this tomorrow, I said simply. What is it? Calvin asked. A framework, I replied. One that keeps everyone included without allowing anyone to disappear. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to, because as I closed the folder, the quiet consequences of everything that had happened finally settled into place. Not through shouting, not through humiliation, but through decisions that changed the way this family would move forward. And for the first time since Hawaii, I prepared to speak not as someone defending her place, but as someone redefining it entirely. I didn't rush the announcement. The new framework sat on my desk overnight, waiting until morning felt steady enough to carry it without emotion. When the family gathered in the conference room, no one spoke loudly. Calvin sat to my left, quieter than he had ever been in these meetings. Talia sat across from me, her posture careful, and as if she finally understood that leadership wasn't something you stepped into by replacing someone else. I placed the folder in the center of the table. This isn't punishment, I began. It's structure. They listened. The new plan didn't remove anyone. It clarified roles. Authority would remain shared, but access to certain decisions required respect, transparency, and collective agreement. Advisors could return only through unanimous consent. Public representation would rotate, ensuring no one voice became the symbol of the family alone. I watched their reactions carefully. Calvin read the pages slowly, nodding at certain sections like he recognized parts of the woman he used to work beside. Talia paused when she reached the leadership guidelines, boundaries written not as walls, but as reminders that partnership had weight. I thought you'd... "Take everything back," she said quietly. "I didn't build this to stand alone," I replied. "I built it so none of us would lose ourselves trying to lead." The room felt lighter after that. Not joyful, but grounded. Later that afternoon, we held a small press event at the community center my late mother once supported. There were no dramatic speeches, no announcements about family conflict. Instead, I introduced a new initiative focused on mentorship and financial education, something rooted in dignity rather than revenge. People congratulated Calvin. They praised Talia's involvement. And when they spoke to me, they didn't mention the Hawaii dinner or the boardroom review. They spoke about legacy. That mattered more than reclaiming a seat at any table. As the event ended, I stood alone near the entrance, watching volunteers gather brochures while the evening sun softened across the courtyard. Calvin approached quietly, hands folded in front of him like he wasn't sure how to begin. "You handled all of this with more grace than I deserved," he said. I didn't answer right away. For years, I had imagined what forgiveness might sound like: loud apologies, long explanations. But standing there beside him, the question felt smaller than everything we had already survived. He hesitated before speaking again. "Do you ever see a future where you forgive me?" His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't demanding. It was honest in a way I hadn't heard from him in a long time. I looked out at the people leaving the building, at the quiet movement of a community that knew nothing about the private battles behind this moment. "Oh, forgiveness isn't a switch," I said gently. "It's something that grows if the ground changes." He nodded, accepting the uncertainty without pressing further. As he walked away, I felt the weight of the question settle quietly inside me, not as a burden, but as something unfinished. Because for the first time since that dinner in Hawaii, the seat I stood in wasn't one someone gave me. It was one I built myself. The house felt different in the weeks that followed. Not louder, not warmer, just more honest. Nobody pretended the past had disappeared. Conversations came slowly, carefully, like people learning how to walk across a floor that had once cracked beneath them. Calvin moved through the house with a quiet awareness he never carried before. He asked questions where he used to make decisions alone. He waited for answers instead of assuming agreement. It wasn't redemption, it was consequence. And sometimes, consequence looks like silence where confidence used to live. Talia came by often, not with grand apologies, but with small, consistent gestures that mattered more. She stopped announcing plans without discussion. She brought draft ideas to me before presenting them publicly. One afternoon, she asked if we could review a proposal together, not because she needed permission, but because she finally understood partnership wasn't weakness. "I don't expect things to feel normal," she said as we sat across from each other in the office, "but I want to rebuild something real." I studied her for a moment, seeing both the daughter I raised and the woman who had made choices she now carried heavily. "Real things take time," I told her, and she nodded, accepting that answer without asking for more. Outside, the community initiative continued to grow. People recognized my name now not because of family status, but because of the work I chose to put into the world. Invitations came in slowly. Speaking events, mentorship programs, partnerships that felt grounded rather than performative. For the first time in years, my identity existed outside the shadow of Calvin's celebrations or Talia's ambitions. One evening, I walked past the dining room where it all began. The long table polished, chairs aligned neatly in place. The memory of Hawaii didn't sting anymore. It felt distant, almost necessary, like a moment that had to happen for truth to arrive. I paused beside one of the chairs and rested my hand lightly on the back. And I realized then that the missing seat had never been about humiliation. It was clarity. A moment that forced me to see what years of quiet compromise had hidden from me. That respect cannot survive where presence becomes optional. Calvin joined me a few minutes later, standing a short distance away. "I've been thinking about that night," he said softly, "about how I stayed silent when I should have spoken." I didn't respond immediately. Some wounds don't need answers, only acknowledgement. "We can't change what happened," he added, "but I'm learning to speak differently now." "That's enough for today," I said gently. He nodded, understanding that forgiveness wasn't something earned through one conversation or one promise. It lived in actions repeated over time. Later that night, I sat alone at the table with a cup of tea, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like a soft reminder that peace doesn't always arrive loudly. I thought about the woman who walked into that Hawaii dinner searching for her name, and the woman sitting here now, no longer waiting for permission to belong. The chair they removed had never defined me. And as I stood to leave the room, one thought settled firmly in my chest, stronger than anything I felt that night. They thought removing my chair would erase me. They forgot I built the table.